The following is an essay that seeks to explain the philosophy behind how movies and television shows are being made today. Once there's an understanding of the philosophy, we can see what its goals are and where it's trying to take us. I'll then make the case for why I think it's wrong to tell stories this way, and what we might do about it moving forward. I hope this essay provides some value to you and added depth to your understanding of the war on entertainment and why it's a medium worth saving. The formula for a good movie has been supplanted by an ideological formula: diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are not what make a movie good. Yet filmmakers persist to prioritize this holy trinity, fostering the exodus of quality in the past 5 to 10 years. It's hard enough to make a good movie with the old formula: a good script, director, producer, and actors who best portray the characters on the page. This formula now plays second fiddle to the woke ideology. Diversity, equity, and inclusion translates to equality of outcome. Decisions rooted in DEI are motivated by an interest in determining an outcome based on race or sex, amongst a few other things, of course. But who defines diversity, equity, and inclusion? Those terms have many definitions, but the definitions chosen by our moral superiors are as follows. Diversity of race and gender, or at least fewer white people, but more specifically, white men. Inclusion: ensuring scripted material does not contain anything that is deemed offensive by our moral superiors. Equity: manipulated outcomes that reflect inclusion and diversity. The point is that diversity, equity, and inclusion are a sequence of buzzwords that mean something far more illiberal and authoritarian than the people using those terms would care to admit. DEI can mean different things to different people. A worthy question would be, who decides which definition is the morally preferred one? Several movie studios, along with the Academy, want minorities and women to be more involved in making movies, so their solution was to legislate this involvement. You can view the Academy's standards for diversity, equity, and inclusion online at this link, which I will include in the description of this video below, along with other major studios' standards for DEI, such as Amazon and Disney. The point is that there are now policies and quotas in place for determining the best movie of the year, according to the Academy, and these quotas have nothing to do with how good a movie is. Movies are now highly rated for their political messaging and emphasis on identity. One example of this is Black Panther. Critics exalted it due to its modern political message. Brian Eggert of Deep Focus Review said, "The film has an unabashed and defiant political viewpoint, supplementing its superhero genre mechanics with a relevant commentary on history, racism, and human injustice." Richard Krause also said, "Boseman's Black Panther is not only capable of fighting the bad guys, but is also a vessel for the film's study of importance of legacy and identity." These reviews focus on the movie's cultural statements, political viewpoints, and emphasis on identity. The aspects of a movie that constitute its quality, like writing, directing, cinematography, etc., are not mentioned. The focus on identity, which can include race or sexual orientation, is stronger than it's ever been. It's also applied in hypocritical ways. For example, stories created outside of the West that were remade with white actors is called cultural appropriation. But remaking stories created by white people with minorities and women is called diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm not saying that the act of casting a black woman in the role of Snow White is a problem, but the reasons for making that casting choice, which is making identity paramount and excluding white people, those reasons are the problem. Morgan Freeman once said something that I think is highly relevant to this discussion.
How are we going to get rid of racism until...
Stop talking about it. I'm going to stop calling you a white man.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man. I know you as Mike Wallace. You know me as Morgan Freeman.
If we stop making race and identity such a focal point in the way that we tell stories, the conversation on racism in its current manifestation will subside, along with all of the chaos and angst around it. But our politicians and media do not share the same goal. One important point that has not been brought up enough in this debate is that the stories, myths, and legends of a culture are made in the image of its creators. The most prominent stories in the West come from civilizations where most people were white. We cannot expect the majority race of any society to base the heroes of their mythologies on people of other races. The question isn't, why doesn't the West have more representation of minorities in its entertainment? It's, why is it illogical or morally wrong for its entertainment to be representative of its most populous ethnic group? Making movies in the DEI way is pandering to a very fringe group of people who clearly don't understand how to make a good movie. If they understood what makes a good movie, they would not be looking at diversity, equity, or inclusion. Also pervasive in modern cinema is crowd favorite fourth wave feminism. Unlike feminism's previous iterations, fourth wave feminism is highly resentful of the way they perceive society to be structured. Christina Hoff Sommers detailed this in her book, Who Stole Feminism, in 1995. Unfortunately, the book may be more applicable now than it was back then. I recommend it if you want to understand why the strong female lead has become so prominent and why white men are now more negatively portrayed in movies and television. A transformationist activist, Charlotte Bunch, declares, "You can't just add women and stir. According to Bunch, we must attack the problem at the roots, by transforming a male culture and by reconstructing the world from the standpoint of women. We must, in other words, reject the masculinist standards that have placed European males like Michelangelo and Shakespeare in the highest ranks and relegated their sisters to oblivion. This is the playbook. You can't just add women and stir. You have to create flawless female characters. This includes portraying women being as physically strong or stronger than men. It seems like the only form of strong Hollywood can come up with for female characters is...
Eat my shit, you nasty bitch! Bitch!
Just do get it done.
Gone are the days of women showing the strength to let their children go. Gone are the days of women showing the fortitude to have compassion and patience in seeing through someone's beastly outer shell to their true character within. Fourth wave feminists seek to transform these versions of femininity that were created by a male culture into this. Sommers explains in her book that once a woman appreciates the extent to which culture and civilization have been male-dominated, two roads lie before her. She can learn what can be learned about women's past achievements, and learn as well the reasons that their contributions to the larger enterprise were not greater, and she can then avail herself of the freedom she now has to accept the challenge to join with men on equal terms in the making of a new and richer culture. Or she can react to the cultural and scientific heritage as androcentric and move consciously to reconstruct the knowledge base. What we're seeing now is an attempt to reconstruct the knowledge base. The knowledge base is the classic Western canon of movies, books, or anything else that's led to the white, male social construction of what a woman is. Since they want to reconstruct this knowledge base, it makes sense that they have to remake classic movies with female leads that fit the boss bitch profile. But one could make a movie with a female lead without deconstructing the classics that came before it. My opinion as to why original films are not being made in the first place comes down to two reasons. The first has been mentioned by George Lucas several times over the last 20 years.
Nobody knows what to do. The stories they're telling are just old movies. Let's do a sequel. Let's do another version of this movie. There's no, and it's not just in movies, but in almost everything. There's no original thinking. The big studios, I mean, they don't want that. They want something that is like something they've seen. Because they don't have an imagination to come up with, to see something that isn't there.
The second reason people keep recreating old movies is because it's an opportunity to transform those stories by making the cast more diverse to create black stories or LGBTQ plus stories or stories led by women. One of the stories from Who Stole Feminism featured Russian women who were tyrannized in the Soviet Union. These women reported that as the Communist Party grew, it threw away the classics that American feminists considered masculinist. The Communist Party then created its own inclusive and diverse set of classics, approved by the party, of course. But these Russian women addressed the American feminist desire to dispense with the original canon of classics. They said they and most of the other Russian writers wanted to return to the canon of masterworks that American feminists consider masculinist. There is only good and bad literature, not male and female. Furthermore, the Russians were seeking to liberate art from politics, including sexual politics. But of course, as we have discussed, this ideology does not seek to liberate sexual politics or racial identity from art. It seeks to make them the focal point, and critics now applaud these efforts and apply higher ratings to TV shows and movies, depending on how closely they toe the line of identity politics and fourth-wave feminism. Susan Faludi, the author of Backlash and one of the more popular fourth-wave feminists of our time, reminds us of the feminist truism that feminist anger comes when women construe their individual experiences in a political framework. When you're not able to see your experience as political, you're not able to be angry about it. Sandra Bartke, who is an expert on something she calls the phenomenology of feminist consciousness, puts it succinctly. Feminist consciousness is consciousness of victimization, to come to see oneself as a victim. These types of feminists are the ones who are being hired by major movie studios, and they have significant creative control over how scripts and stories are shaped. Both fourth-wave feminism and DEI policies are heavily influenced by postmodernism. The postmodern era refers to the time period from about 1970 to present day, although the first use of the term postmodern was supposedly in 1870. A handful of French intellectuals developed a philosophy during this time period that challenged the nature of knowledge itself. There are two books that will give you a greater understanding of postmodernism than most people. The first is Explaining Postmodernism by Stephen Hicks. Hicks explains how postmodernism began with Immanuel Kant in the 18th century as a way to preserve religion. It's a challenging book, but worth it if you're interested in a philosophical deep dive into postmodernism. I recommend first starting with it, but if you only read one book about postmodernism, read Cynical Theories by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay to get an overview of where postmodernism came from and how it's applied today. Postmodernism posits that there are no universal truths, and that society is fundamentally structured to perpetuate systems of power, which are driven by dominant discourses, or conversations. Think of the Western canon of movies and books we discussed earlier as part of the dominant discourse. The discourse in the West is our framework of knowledge, ethics, morals, and human nature. The discourse is essentially Western civilization itself. Books and movies contain the truths of Western civilization, which is seen by postmodernists as white, patriarchal, and heteronormative. If we dominate the discourse with entertainment featuring LGBTQ+ characters, strong women, diversity, and oppressive men, the new truth of our civilization will eventually be established. It's worth pointing out the inherent contradiction in this philosophy. Believing that there are no universal truths is to believe in a truth that says there are no universal truths. If all of this sounds crazy, read the books I've mentioned. They do a much better job articulating this information. But if you read the works of the postmodernists and fourth-wave feminists, you'll find that this is what they say. I don't think that every person in Hollywood is a postmodernist or fourth-wave feminist. I think there are a lot of good people in Hollywood who would like to create stories through merit-based hiring practices, but with the aforementioned DEI quotas, that's not very feasible right now. Another crucial aspect of postmodernism is it looks at the world through a Marxist lens, where people are divided neatly into two categories: oppressors and oppressed. The postmodernists do not necessarily see the system of oppression as the result of a consciously coordinated, patriarchal, white supremacist, heteronormative conspiracy. Instead, they regard it as the inevitable result of self-perpetuating systems that privilege some groups over others, which constitute an unconscious, uncoordinated conspiracy inherent to systems involving power. They believe, however, that those systems are patriarchal, white supremacist, and heteronormative, and therefore necessarily grant unfair access to straight, white, Western men, and work to maintain that status quo by excluding the perspectives of women and of racial and sexual minorities. If power is taken and maintained through discourses, it means that if the discourse is made more inclusive per se, power will be shifted from oppressive white men to the oppressed, women and ethnic and sexual minorities. We can make the discourse more inclusive by making movies that expose white men for what they are. We can have fourth-wave feminists reveal the female experience. We can turn characters who were once stoic into complete buffoons. We can limit the creation of straight white male characters like Luke Skywalker and Indiana Jones. At the same time, we can turn the actual Luke Skywalker and Indiana Jones into weak old men that merely play second fiddle to the strong woman. We could even make a movie about toxic masculinity and just call it Men. Hey, look at that. The main villain is a white man. We could make movies that highlight how racist white people were in the 60s, and pretend that it's just as bad now as it was back then. Alexa Dalby said of the trial of the Chicago 7, "To see this racist humiliation now, by the out-of-his-depth Judge Hoffman, played by Frank Langella, is gasp-out-loud shocking, and yet sadly resonant in the present-day brutal treatment and killings of African Americans." Matthew Roska added, "The trial of the Chicago 7 might be the ultimate movie about how to fight the far right, an artistic testament to pragmatism and a cry of rage in the era of Donald Trump and Derek Chauvin." Cynical Theories says the intense focus on identity categories and identity politics means that the individual and the universal are largely devalued. While mainstream liberalism focuses on achieving universal human rights and access to opportunities to allow each individual to fulfill her potential, applied postmodernism scholarship and activism is deeply skeptical of these values and even openly hostile to them. Applied postmodern theory tends to regard mainstream liberalism as complacent, naive, or indifferent about the deeply ingrained prejudices, assumptions, and biases that limit and constrain people with marginalized identities. The individual in applied postmodernism is something like the sum total of the identity groups to which the person in question simultaneously belongs. To close, I'm going to make the case for why it's wrong to tell stories this way, and what we might do moving forward. But before that, if you feel like the information in this video has been valuable to you, please give the video a thumbs up. I hope what I offered is helpful in terms of understanding why movies today are made the way they are. But please let me know in the comments below what you think, and if you're so inclined to subscribe to my channel, I'd love to have you. Hollywood's obsession with identity is a Marxist idea at its core. Karl Marx divided the world by class, separating the bourgeois, the middle class, from the proletariat, the lower class. Marxism does not look past these labels. Those labels make you either the oppressor or the oppressed. Under this doctrine, it's estimated that around 100 million people died. This happened because in order to liberate the oppressed, tyranny must be inflicted on the oppressors. They're not just going to stop oppressing, so you have to rip them from their homes in the middle of the night, torture them, and ship them off to labor camps. And this process was detailed in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago. Classic Marxism's division of people based on economic status provided the foundation of the more modern idea of intersectionality. Intersectionality looks at one's identity and infers who you are and what's happened to you from your looks alone. I'm not saying that this current form of Marxism will lead to the deaths of 100 million people. But one of the steps in achieving that horrible end was to divide people into the oppressed and oppressors. In today's terms, the oppressed are minorities and women, and the oppressors are straight white men. Looking at the world through a Marxist lens can cause one to become bitter and resentful. It allows you to ignore the sufferings of individuals and instead think of people monolithically. When it's impossible to sort out all of the corrupt individuals from the population, consolidating corruption into one single identity allows for the efficient removal of that identity, which is something we saw in Nazi Germany with the Jews and the Soviet Union with the bourgeois. While the United States has a checkered past in dealing with issues of racism and sexism, as all nations do, the US has gone further than any nation in pursuing equality of opportunity for all citizens. The Enlightenment values and tenets of liberalism we established over the millennia brought us to a point in time where we were able to put race aside and judge people by the content of their character. It took a long time for those values to be accepted as widely as they were and are. They were achieved by emphasizing our similarities, uniting us through the idea that all men are created equal, and that anyone born in this nation deserves that freedom. First-wave feminism and the civil rights movement worked very hard to move the spotlight off sex and race, to not have that be a consideration when passing judgment. This is the message we want to be teaching our sons and daughters. Movies are part of what shapes our culture. They inspire, inform, and move us. They show us the path of the hero's journey. But when this identity-obsessed ideology infects our storytelling, as it has, the next generation will not see the value in every individual. They will not see that to some degree, everyone suffers, and that it's not a competition to see who suffers more. They will see that their identity is what defines them. They'll see that life is an eternal struggle between the oppressed and oppressors. They'll be taught to see race and gender before all else. And even though I believe we can never achieve total equality, we can come damn near close using the classically liberal values our nation was founded upon. Values that could be passed on to future generations through our stories. We should strive to get back to using the proven formula to tell good stories. It works. It doesn't focus on equality of outcome, but it does better than anything else in achieving a quality outcome. Diversity, equity, and inclusion do not make movies good. It never has been the standard, and it never should. The lack of quality we experience today is one of the many consequences of prioritizing that philosophy above all else. The studios will either figure that out or lose money. And in the race to lose money, Disney seems to want to win the most. Moviegoers will continue to speak with their pocketbooks, and we can only hope that movie studios will take that information and pivot away from producing propaganda. We cannot continue to address past discrimination with more discrimination. The road to equality of opportunity has already been paved. It will never be perfect, and unfortunately for us, it's a long road that requires patience. Acknowledging our shared values and rights is what has united us in the past. I hope we wake up in time to pick up the pieces of that philosophy moving forward.